The air in this space is thick, heavy with the scent of unwashed wool and the lingering damp smell of stone that hasn't seen the sun in 100 years. You're lying on a pallet of straw that has been compressed into a hard, unforgiving lump beneath your back. Every time you shift, the dry stalks rustle and snap, releasing a faint cloud of dust that tickles your throat. The temperature is a persistent, biting chill that seems to emanate from the very floor, a cold that doesn't just sit on your skin but slowly, methodically, begins to claim your bones. The light is weak, a bruised shade of grey filtering through a narrow slit high up in the masonry. It's barely enough to reveal the texture of the walls, rough, weeping with condensation, and covered in a fine green film of mildew. You take a slow, deep breath, and you can feel the moisture in the air, a cool, metallic taste on the back of your tongue. Your breath hitches slightly as you hear a rhythmic sound in the distance, the slow, heavy thud of a wooden door closing, followed by the muffled, hollow clink of an iron key turning in a lock. Before we sink deeper into the strange, tangled web of the past, I invite you to settle in. If you find yourself enjoying these quiet explorations of history's more peculiar corners, please feel free to like the video. If you wish to join us for more journeys into the night, you are welcome to subscribe. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time has the darkness found you there? There is a certain comfort in knowing we're all drifting through time together. Now, let the modern world dissolve. Forget the glow of your screens and the hum of your heaters. Let the silence of the old world wrap around you like a heavy, scratchy blanket. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1324. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? You've been accused of stealing a pig you've never even met, and the only way to prove your innocence is to survive a swimming lesson designed by a local priest who thinks air is a sign of guilt. Welcome to the wonderful world of trial by water. It is a system of justice where the logic is so circular it would make a modern bureaucrat weep with envy. You are currently being led toward a pond at the edge of the village. The ground beneath your feet is a slurry of cold mud and sharp gravel, the texture grinding against your bare soles. You can smell the stagnant water before you see it, a mix of rotting reeds, frog spawn, and the general decay of a landscape that doesn't believe in drainage. The local magistrate, a man whose hat is significantly more expensive than your entire life, stands on the bank. He's wrapped in heavy furs despite the dampness, his breath coming in short, arrogant puffs of white mist. To him, this isn't a tragedy, it's a Tuesday. He believes in the judgment of God, which is a fancy way of saying he's outsourced his job to the local geography. The rules are simple, yet devastating. You are tied up, right thumb to left thumb to right toe, until you are a human ball of confusion. The texture of the hemp rope is abrasive, biting into your wrists and ankles with a dry, splintering heat. The priest blesses the water, declaring it a pure element that will only accept the innocent. According to this high-level intellectual framework, if you are guilty, the holy water will reject you, and you will float to the surface like a piece of unwanted driftwood. If you're innocent, the water will embrace you, and you will sink. As they toss you in, the temperature shift is a physical shock. The water is an icy, suffocating embrace. You feel the weight of your own body pulling you down into the dark, silty depths. The sound of the world above, the magistrate's drone, the priest's chanting, is suddenly replaced by the rhythmic, distorted thrum of your own heartbeat in your ears. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. You are currently in the innocent phase, which mostly involves inhaling mud, and wondering why nobody mentioned that winning a trial involves a high probability of never breathing again. The system is perfect because it removes the burden of proof from the humans and places it on the physics of a stagnant pond. If you float, you're a criminal who must be hanged. If you sink, you're a saint who is currently becoming part of the local ecosystem. You feel the texture of the pond floor, slimy, yielding, and ancient. Your breath is a burning sensation in your chest, a desperate demand for oxygen that the justice system has decided you don't actually need if your soul is clean. Just as the darkness starts to close in, you feel a hook snag your tunic. They pull you out, dragging your shivering, sodden form back onto the mud. You're alive, you're innocent. But you're also freezing, covered in pond scum, and the magistrate has already moved on to the next case, leaving you to find your own way home in the biting wind. The elites call this divine clarity. You call it a very long way to go to prove you didn't touch a pig. This is just the first layer of the medieval legal onion, and trust me, every layer you peel back only makes your eyes water more. The icy dampness of the pond still clings to your skin, but the air around you has shifted. You're no longer standing in the mud. You have been ushered into the flickering, orange-hued interior of the village church. The temperature here is a confusing battle between the ancient stone-cold draught of the nave and the sudden, radiating blast of heat coming from a brazier near the altar. It's a dry, searing heat that makes the moisture on your tunic turn into a thin, rising steam. You can smell the heavy, cloying scent of frankincense and beeswax, but underneath it is a sharper, more industrial aroma, the smell of glowing charcoal and hot, agitated iron. You take a breath, and the air feels thin, scorched at the edges, catching in the back of your throat. You're here because the trial by water was deemed inconclusive by a clerk who lost his place in the ledger. Now, the system has decided that if the water won't speak, the fire certainly will. Welcome to the trial by hot iron. In the eyes of the medieval elite, the skin on your palm is not just a part of your body. It is a spiritual parchment upon which God will write his verdict. A minor official with a remarkably straight nose and a scroll of parchment stands nearby, looking at you with the detached curiosity one might show to a particularly stubborn weed. He isn't interested in your alibi, or the fact that you were actually 3 villages away when the pig vanished. He is interested in the rule of 3. The priest reaches into the coals with a pair of long black tongs. The sound is a rhythmic clink-scrape-hiss as he retrieves a heavy iron bar. The metal isn't just hot, it's vibrating with a dull, red malevolence. The texture of the iron, even from a distance, looks pitted and cruel. According to the legal experts of 1324, men who spend their days sitting on velvet cushions, you must carry this bar for exactly 9 feet. As your fingers close around the iron, the temperature doesn't just rise, it becomes an absolute. The pain is a white noise that drowns out the chanting. Your breath comes in short, ragged gasps that sound like a bellows in the silence of the church. You walk. 1 step on the cold flagstones, 2 steps through the haze of incense, 3 steps toward a justice that feels increasingly like a blacksmithing accident. Once the 9 feet are covered, they don't look at your hand. That would be too logical. Instead, the priest wraps the scorched flesh in coarse linen. The texture of the fabric is like sandpaper against a wound, a dry, fibrous irritation. They seal the bandage with wax and tell you to come back in 3 days. This is the waiting period, for the miracle of the scab. The logic of the system is a masterpiece of bureaucratic distancing. In 3 days they will unwrap the hand. If the wound is clean, which in medieval medical terms means it hasn't turned into a sentient green fungus, you are innocent. If it is foul, you are guilty. They have essentially turned your immune system into a jury. If you have a particularly robust white blood cell count, you're a law-abiding citizen. If you have a minor infection, you're a thief who deserves the noose. The sound of the priest's voice as he dismisses you is a low, monotonous drone, blending with the distant, rhythmic tolling of the bell. Bong, bong. You walk out into the cooling evening air, your hand throbbing, in time with the heartbeat you can feel in your fingertips. The elites call this the purifying flame. You call it a very painful way to discover that bandages in the 14th century are never quite clean enough, but don't worry, even if the iron fails. To convict you, the medieval legal system has plenty of other ways to make sure your day remains unnecessarily complicated. The air in the local manor hall is different from the church. It lacks the sacred weight of incense, replaced instead by the dry, suffocating scent of old parchment and the sharp, acidic tang of spilled ale. The temperature is a deceptive, hollow chill. While a fire crackles in the great hearth at the far end of the room, the heat never quite reaches you. It's a distant orange glow that teases your skin without warming it, leaving you to shiver in the draughts that sneak through the gaps in the timber-framed walls. You find yourself standing before a heavy oak table, the texture of which is a map of ancient scars, notches from daggers, stains from wax, and the smooth, greasy patina left by generations of elbows. You take a slow, rhythmic breath, and the air tastes of dust and damp wool. Your breath is a faint, translucent cloud in the dim light, a tiny ghost that disappears as soon as it's born. The sound of the hall is a percussive clutter, the rhythmic scratching of a clerk's quill against calfskin, the low-frequency mumble of spectators, and the dry rustle of the rushes on the floor as someone shifts their weight. Welcome to the wager of law, also known as compurgation. The elites of the legal world, men who have never had to dig a furrow in their lives, have decided that the best way to determine if you stole that pig is to see how many friends you have. It's essentially a popularity contest disguised as a judicial procedure. The rule is simple. If you can find 11 other men to stand in a line and swear, under the threat of eternal damnation, that you're telling the truth, the law will believe you. You look at your oath helpers. They are a collection of villagers whose tunics smell of goat and wood smoke. Their hands, calloused and stained with earth, rest nervously on their belts. The texture of their presence is one of shared anxiety. According to the high-minded bureaucrats in London, the collective weight of 12 souls speaking in unison creates a barrier that lies cannot penetrate. The magistrate, a man who looks like he's bored by the very concept of gravity, leans forward. The sound of his velvet sleeves rubbing against the table is a soft, sibilant hiss. He doesn't ask for evidence. He doesn't ask for the pig. He asks for the formula. You must recite an oath, perfectly, without stumbling or coughing. In this system, a dry throat is as damning as a confession. You begin to speak. Your voice feels small in the vast drafty space. By the Lord, the oath which I have sworn is pure and unperjured. You can feel the eyes of the court on your throat, waiting for a hitch, a crack, or a swallow. If you stutter, it's not nerves. It's God physically tripping your tongue to reveal your guilt. It's a linguistic obstacle course, where the prize is not being hanged. One by, on, your 11 friends repeat the refrain. The sound is a rhythmic, hypnotic drone. The oath is clean. The oath is clean. You feel the texture of the air change, becoming heavy with the pressure of the moment. The smell of unwashed bodies and damp rushes intensifies as the tension peaks. The magistrate sighs, a long weary sound that suggests he'd rather be anywhere else. He nods. Because the formula was recited without a sneeze, the law considers the pig theft disproven. You have won, not because you're innocent, but because you managed to find 11 people willing to gamble their afterlives on your reputation. The elites call this communal integrity. You call it a very stressful way to realize who your real friends are. As you leave the hall, the cool wind of the courtyard hits you, a sharp, bracing contrast to the stagnant air of the courtroom. You take a deep, steady breath of the evening mist. The sound of the village, the distant barking of a dog, the rhythmic clanging of the smithy returns to its normal volume. But don't get too comfortable. In the medieval world, the law doesn't just happen in halls. Sometimes it happens in a fenced-off circle with a very large man holding a club. The air in the village square is biting, a sharp, frost-edged wind that cuts through your thin linen shirt and settles in the small of your back. You're standing in the centre of a small, cordoned-off circle of earth that has been trampled into a slurry of freezing mud and jagged ice. The temperature is a cruel, unyielding pressure, making your fingers feel like stiff wooden pegs. You can smell the nervous sweat of the crowd, the damp musk of wet wool, and the metallic coppery scent of the blood that hasn't even been spilled yet. You take a heavy, shuddering breath, and the cold air stings your lungs, leaving a dry, ashy taste on your palate. Your breath escapes in frantic, rhythmic puffs, a white fog that momentarily masks the face of the man standing opposite you. The sound of the square is a low, aggressive hum, the rhythmic jeering of the villagers, the sharp snap of banners in the wind, and the hollow rhythmic thud of a herald staff against the frozen ground. Welcome to trial by combat. The legal geniuses of the age, men who spend their afternoons discussing the finer points of theology while sipping spiced wine, have decided that the ultimate test of truth is a physical wrestling match with weapons. The logic is beautifully unhinged. God, being the ultimate arbiter of justice, will surely grant supernatural strength to the person who is telling the truth. In this system, your arm's ability to swing a club is the only evidence the court is willing to accept. You are handed your legal representative, a heavy wooden club topped with a piece of sharpened horn. The texture of the handle is rough, the grain of the wood biting into your palms with a splintery, abrasive heat. It feels balanced for destruction, not for justice. Your opponent, a man who looks like he was carved out of a granite cliff, is currently oiling his leather tunic. To the elites, this is a divine dialogue. To you, it's a very public way to get a concussion. The herald, a man whose voice sounds like gravel being ground in a mortar begins to read the charges. The sound is a monotonous, rhythmic drone that treats your impending injuries as a minor clerical error. He explains that if you can make your opponent cry out the word craven before the sun goes down, you are innocent. If you fail, or if you die, you are guilty, and your body will be disposed of with the same lack of ceremony as a rotten turnip. The signal is given. The sound of a trumpet, a shrill metallic blast, shatters the tension. You move. The texture of the mud beneath your boots is treacherous, a slippery, cold resistance that threatens to upend your legal argument before you even reach the centre of the ring. You feel a blow land against your shoulder. The sound is a dull, sickening thud crunch that vibrates through your teeth. The temperature of your body begins to rise, a hot, desperate sweat breaking out beneath the cold wind. Your breath comes in ragged, rhythmic gasps that sound like a dying bellows. You realise that in the year 1324, truth is something you have to hammer into another human being until they stop moving. The magistrate, sitting on a raised platform under a canopy, watches with a look of profound boredom, perhaps wondering if the local inn has finished roasting the evening's mutton. You swing your club, the wood whistling through the air with a rhythmic whoosh. You aren't fighting for a pig anymore. You're fighting against a system that decided physics and faith are the same thing. The elites call this the appeal to the heavens. You call it a very exhausting way to prove you don't have a criminal record. As the sun begins its slow, indifferent descent toward the horizon, you realise that the medieval law doesn't want your facts. It wants your endurance. You've barely had time to nurse the bruise on your shoulder from the combat ring before the evening air is shattered once again. The temperature has dropped further, turning the damp mist into a fine, clinging frost that settles on your eyelashes. You're walking back toward your cottage, hoping for nothing more than a bowl of thin pottage and a dark corner to hide in. But in 1324, your silence is not your own. You're a biological alarm system for a bureaucracy that doesn't want to pay for a police force. You can smell the wood smoke from the village hearths, a sweet, comforting aroma that is suddenly cut by the sharp, acidic scent of adrenaline. You take a breath, and the cold air feels like a jagged piece of flint in your throat. Your breath escapes in quick rhythmic stutters as a voice nearby erupts into a piercing, unnatural shriek. Out! Out! Thieves! Thieves! Welcome to the hue and cry. The elites, men who live behind high stone walls and iron-bolted gates, have decided that the most efficient way to catch a criminal is to make it illegal for you to mind your own business. The rule is absolute. If a crime is committed and the victim screams, you must drop whatever you're doing, whether you're mid-meal, mid-prayer or mid-sleep, and join the chase. In this system, your neighbourhood is a mandatory high-stakes game of tag, where the penalty for not playing is a fine that could cost you your harvest. You feel the texture of your worn leather boots as you start to run, the thin soles offering zero protection against the frozen ruts of the road. You join the rhythmic slap-thud-slap of dozens of other villagers pouring out of their huts. The sound is a chaotic, percussive roar, the barking of lean, hungry dogs, the clanging of iron ladles against bronze pots, and the repetitive, exhausted shouting of the mob. The logic of the hue and cry is a masterpiece of collective punishment. If the village fails to catch the thief, the magistrate doesn't blame the criminal, he blames the geography. The entire 100, the administrative district you live in, is held financially responsible for the stolen goods. If the pig isn't returned, the local lord simply reaches into the pockets of every family in the parish. They have turned the concept of community into a mutual insurance policy backed by the threat of the stocks. You're currently sprinting through a patch of brambles. The texture of the thorns is a series of sharp, rhythmic stings against your shins, drawing thin lines of blood that feel hot in the freezing wind. You breathe in, and the air tastes of churned mud and the heavy musk of the livestock you're trampling past. Your breath is a ragged, burning whistle in your chest. You aren't chasing the thief because you care about justice. You're chasing him because you can't afford to pay for his success. The magistrate's clerk stands by the village well, watching the chaos with the cold, calculating eye of a man counting coins. To the elites, this isn't about safety, it's about liability. If you don't scream loud enough, you're an accessory. If you don't run fast enough, you're a tax evader. It's a justice system built on the premise that everyone is guilty of something, even if it's just a lack of enthusiasm for a midnight jog. You swing a heavy wooden pitchfork, the texture of the handle smooth and greasy from years of sweat. The sound of the mob begins to fade as the thief disappears into the dark woods. You stop, your lungs burning, your breath a thick white plume in the moonlight. The elites call this the vigilant spirit of the realm. You call it a very efficient way to make sure nobody ever gets a full night's sleep. As the cry dies down and the villagers begin to mutter their frustrations, you realise that in the medieval legal world, you're either the hunter, the hunted, or the person paying for the privilege of being both. The air in the great barn where the manor court is held is stagnant, a thick, motionless warmth that smells of ancient fermenting hay and the sharp, ammonia-heavy scent of oxen that were stabled here just hours ago. The temperature is a deceptive, heavy blanket trapping the heat of 50 unwashed bodies under a low thatched roof. It's the kind of warmth that makes your eyelids feel heavy, a slow, biological humidity that seems to turn the very air into a liquid you have to push through with every shallow breath. You're standing in the back, your fingers absent-mindedly tracing the texture of a splintered support beam. Rough, jagged wood that feels dry and thirsty against your skin. You take a breath, and the air tastes of fine grain dust and the metallic tang of the steward's ink pot. Your breath is slow and rhythmic, a quiet counterpoint to the monotonous, high-pitched scratching of the clerk's quill. This is the Halmote, the manor court, where the justice is less about right and wrong and more about how many pennies the Lord can squeeze out of your pockets for the crime of existing. Welcome to the View of Frank Pledge. The elites, men who live in stone towers and eat off silver plates, have decided that the best way to keep you in line is to make your neighbours your jailers. You belong to a tithing, a group of 10 men who are legally responsible for each other's behaviour. If one man in your group steals a chicken or misses a day of work and the rest of you don't tattle on him, the whole group is fined. It's a justice system built on the premise that friendship is a taxable liability. You watch the steward, a man who treats the law like a grocery list, lean over his ledger. The sound of the courtroom is a dull, percussive rhythm. The steady thump-thump of his staff against the dirt floor, the rustle of parchment being turned, and the low-frequency drone of villagers reciting their excuses. To the steward, you aren't a human being. You are a tenant in villanage, a biological asset that needs to be regularly audited. The clerk calls your name for the crime of the private handmill. You see, the Lord has a monopoly on physics. According to the rules of the manor, you are forbidden from grinding your own grain. You must carry your heavy sacks to the Lord's mill, wait in a rhythmic, soul-crushing line, and pay a multure, a percentage of your flour, for the privilege of using his water-powered stones. The texture of the grain you tried to hide at home is a gritty golden weight in your memory. You were caught because a neighbour, fearing a tithing fine, reported the sound of your small stone quern turning in the night. The penalty is a mercy, which in 1324 means you owe the Lord 3 pence, or the equivalent of 2 days' worth of your life. The steward doesn't look up as he delivers the sentence. He is already thinking about the next case. A woman being fined for a lecher white, or the audacity of having a child without a marriage licence. In this system, even the most private moments of your life have a price tag attached by the manor office. You reach into your tunic and pull out the coins. The texture of the silver is thin, cold, and worn smooth by 1,000 desperate hands. You hand them over, and the sound of them hitting the wooden collection bowl, a sharp, lonely clink, is the final punctuation mark on your legal defence. The air in the barn seems to grow even heavier as the session nears its end. You hear the rhythmic, distant shush-shush of the wind through the eaves, a sound that promises a cold walk home. The elites call this the maintenance of manorial order. You call it a very expensive way to be told that even the wind and the stones belong to someone else. As you step out of the stifling heat of the barn into the cool, ashy twilight, you realise that in the medieval world the law doesn't want to fix your problems. It just wants to make sure your debts are recorded in a language you can't even read. The air inside the parish cathedral is a different world entirely. A vast, hollow silence that seems to swallow the very concept of the village outside. The temperature is a permanent tomb-like chill, a cold so ancient it feels as though it has been trapped here since the stones were first quarried. It's a dry, dusty cold that settles on your skin like a fine layer of powdered bone. You are huddled in a corner of the nave, your back pressed against a pillar. The texture of the stone is a chaotic map of chisel marks and cold, damp grit. You take a slow, cautious breath and the air tastes of old wax, cold ash, and the faint, sweet rot of the ancestors buried beneath the flagstones. Your breath is a ghostly, rhythmic whisper, the only thing connecting you to the world of the living. Welcome to the law of sanctuary. You're here because, in a moment of questionable judgment, you struck a man who insulted your mother's lineage. According to the elites, men who write the laws while, sitting in sun-drenched gardens, violence is a sin, but bureaucracy is divine. Because you managed to reach the cathedral and grab the heavy iron knocker on the door before the magistrate's men grabbed you, you're now legally untouchable. The texture of that iron knocker, cold, pitted and smelling of rust, is the only thing between you and the gallows. The rule is a masterpiece of religious theatre. You have exactly 40 days to stay within these walls. During this time, the secular law cannot touch you, provided you don't mind the cathedral diet, which mostly consists of stale bread and the occasional drop of sacramental wine if a monk is feeling particularly charitable. You hear the rhythmic clack-clack of sandals on stone as a brother approaches to bring you a bowl of thin broth. The sound echoes up into the vaulted ceiling, a rhythmic reminder that your time is being measured by a clock made of prayer. But there's a catch, because in 1324 there is always a catch. After 40 days you must make a choice. You can surrender to the local hangman, or you can abjure the realm. This is a fancy way of saying you have to leave the country forever, barefoot, wearing nothing but a white sackcloth tunic and carrying a small wooden cross. It's a medieval witness protection program where the protection involves a very long walk to a port and a high probability of being eaten by a bear in a foreign forest. The coroner, a man who looks like he's made of dried parchment and bad news, arrives on the 40th day. The sound of his quill scratching against a scroll is a sharp, rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch. He doesn't look at you. He only cares about the sanctuary port. He points his bony finger at a map and assigns you a destination. Dover. From this moment, you are a legal ghost. You must stay on the King's Highway, you must not deviate, and you must reach the sea before your crosses wear out. You feel the texture of the sackcloth, as they drape it over you, coarse, itchy, and smelling of lye. It's a garment designed for maximum discomfort, a physical penance for your legal inconvenience. You're handed the wooden cross. The texture is smooth, unvarnished pine that feels light and fragile in your hand. Your breath comes in shallow, anxious puffs as you stand at the church threshold. Outside, the village is waiting, and they aren't happy that you've used a religious loophole to avoid their justice. The sound of the bell, clanging, rhythmic and heavy, marks your departure. You step out. The texture of the road is a shock to your bare feet. Freezing mud, sharp flints, and the discarded filth of the market. To the elites, this is spiritual cleansing through exile. To you, it's a very long way to walk just to see a different kind of rain. You begin your journey, a lone figure in white moving through a landscape of grey. The law has spared your life, but it has taken your home, your name, and your shoes. As you walk, the rhythmic thud-squelch of your steps becomes your only companion, a steady beat in a world that decided it was easier to throw you away than to forgive you. The morning air is a thin, translucent veil of silver, a mist that clings to the low-lying fields and wraps itself around the gnarled trunks of the apple trees. The temperature is a mild, damp coolness, the kind of weather that feels soft against your face, but leaves a persistent dewy weight on your wool cloak. You're standing on a dirt track just outside the village, your fingers absent-mindedly tracing the texture of a wooden fence post. The grain is weathered, silvered by years of rain, and feels cool and slightly damp under your touch. You take a slow, deep breath, and the air tastes of crushed grass, wet earth, and the faint, distant smell of a woodcutter's fire. Your breath is steady, rhythmic, a quiet pulse in the early morning hush that is only broken by the occasional sharp thwack of an axe against timber somewhere across the valley. Welcome to the law of the deodand. The elites of the legal world, men who believe that logic is a flexible commodity, have decided that justice isn't just for people. In the medieval mind, inanimate objects can be just as sinful as any thief. If a cart runs over a man, or a tree falls on a traveller, or even a heavy iron pot falls and kills a kitchen maid, the object itself is declared deodand, meaning given to God. In practice, God looks remarkably like the local tax collector with a very large ledger. You are currently witnessing the arrest of an ox cart. The cart is an imposing structure of seasoned oak and forged iron. The texture of the wheels, a chaotic mix of caked mud and cold, rusted metal. A man was killed when the cart tipped in a rut, and now the coroner, a man whose face is as wrinkled and dry as the parchment he carries, has arrived to put the vehicle on trial. To the coroner, this cart isn't just wood and nails. It's a biological offender. He treats the wheel with a level of suspicion normally reserved for a known heretic. The sound of the road is a rhythmic, bureaucratic clutter. You hear the sharp, dry scratch of the quill as the coroner appraises the cart's value. In 1324, justice is a profitable business. The rule states that the value of the guilty object must be forfeit to the crown. If the cart is worth 10 shillings, the family of the deceased gets nothing, but the king's treasury gets another deposit. It's a system built on the premise that tragedy is an excellent opportunity for an audit. The coroner moves his hand along the rim of the wheel. The texture is rough, jagged where the iron has hit the stones of the road. He mutters to himself about the agency of the timber. According to the high-level legal theory of the day, the cart had a choice, and it chose violence. Therefore the cart must be cleansed by being sold, with the proceeds supposedly going to charity. However, in a world where the king defines charity as anything that funds a war in France, you can guess exactly where the coins are headed. The temperature begins to rise as the sun breaks through the mist, a gentle, warming pressure on your shoulders. You breathe in, and the air tastes of the oily grease used to lubricate the cart's axles, a heavy, tallow-like scent that lingers on the breeze. Your breath is slow, synchronized with the rhythmic clink-clink-clink of the coroner's assistant counting out the weight of the iron fittings. The absurdity of the situation is played out with absolute deadpan seriousness. The cart doesn't have a lawyer, and it certainly doesn't have a plea, but the law proceeds as if the wood can hear. If the cart had been moving, everything, the wheels, the frame, even the oxen pulling it, is forfeit. If the cart was stationary and the man merely fell off it, only the specific wheel that crushed him is guilty. It's a justice system that requires a surveyor's level and a priest to determine the moral weight of a stationary wagon. You feel the texture of the air change, becoming dry and ashy, as the village life resumes around the crime scene. The sounds of the valley return, the rhythmic lowing of cattle, the distant chime of the church bell. The elites call this the purgation of accursed things. You call it a very strange way for the king to own a piece of every accident in the realm. As the coroner finishes his marks and the cart is dragged away by the king's men, you realise that in the medieval world, even the stones beneath your feet are subject to a law that can find a profit in a falling leaf. The air in the holding cell beneath the Guildhall is a heavy, motionless soup of ancient dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of unwashed iron. The temperature is a deceptive, hollow dampness, the kind of cold that doesn't just sit on your skin but seems to wait for you to stop moving so it can seep into your marrow. You're sitting on a bench of worm-eaten oak, the texture of the wood a series of sharp ridges and soft, decaying pits that snag against your wool tunic. You take a slow, rhythmic breath, and the air tastes of salt, old leather, and the dry, powdery scent of the lime wash flaking off the walls. Your breath is a faint, translucent plume in the single shaft of moonlight that manages to pierce the darkness, a tiny, flickering sign of life in a room built for waiting. The sound of the cell is a rhythmic, dripping monotony. You hear the slow, deliberate plip, plip, plip of water condensing on a lead pipe somewhere in the masonry, and the distant, sibilant hiss of the wind through the iron bars of the high window. It's a sound that measures time in fractions of a second, a reminder that the world outside is moving while you're held in stasis by the gears of a bureaucracy you don't understand. Welcome to the benefit of clergy, the elites of the legal world, men who believe that the ability to decipher ink on a page is a sign of divine selection, have created a loophole so wide you could drive an ox cart through it. You see, in 1324, the law is not one single entity. It is a fractured landscape of competing powers. If you are a commoner, you face the king's justice, which usually involves a short rope and a long drop. But if you're a member of the clergy, you face the bishop's court, where the punishments involve prayers, fasting, and perhaps a small fine that won't ruin your life. The problem, of course, is how to prove you are a man of God in an age where ID cards don't exist, and your tunic is covered in more mud than holy oil. The legal geniuses, men who spend their mornings debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, have decided that the ultimate test of holiness is the literacy exam. If you can read a single verse from the Bible, the law assumes you are a priest, and therefore too valuable to be hanged for stealing a silver spoon. You are currently staring at a scrap of parchment that a clerk has shoved through the bars. The texture of the parchment is oily and stiff, made from the skin of a calf and still bearing the faint, ghostly imprints of hair follicles. It smells of vinegar and animal glue. You take a breath, and the air is thick with the scent of the clerk's candle, a heavy, greasy tallow that reminds you of a butcher's shop. Your breath is shaky, rhythmic, a nervous flutter in the stillness. The verse they've given you is Psalm 51, verse 1. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness." In the village, this is known as the neck verse, because reading it correctly is the only thing that will save your neck from the noose. The irony is as thick as the mud in the marketplace. The judge knows you aren't a priest, the priest knows you aren't a priest, and you certainly know you aren't a priest. But as long as you can recite the Latin, words without a stutter, the bureaucracy is satisfied. The system values the performance of education over the reality of the crime. You move your finger along the letters, the texture of the ink is slightly raised, a dry brittle crust of crushed oak galls and iron salts. You begin to speak, your voice a rhythmic, low-frequency mumble that echoes in the small cell. Miserere me Deus. You can hear the clerk's quill scratching against his ledger, a sharp, rhythmic scritch-scritch as he prepares to mark you as clergy. To the elites, this is the protection of the learned. To you, it's a very strange way to discover that memorizing a few words in a dead language is more important than an alibi. The temperature in the cell seems to lift slightly as you finish the verse, a psychological warmth born of the realization that you aren't going to die today. You breathe in, and the air tastes less like fear and more like the stale ale the clerk is drinking in the next room. Your breath evens out, synchronizing with the rhythmic clack-clack of the clerk's sandals as he walks away to fetch the keys. The absurdity of the law is played out with absolute hushed reverence. Because you can read, even if you've just memorized the sounds like a parrot, you are legally a different species of human. You'll be handed over to the church, given a few weeks of penance in a comfortable monastery, and then released to steal another spoon. The elites call this the dignity of the cloth. You call it a very fortunate loophole in a system that prefers rules to logic. As the iron door creaks open and the sound of the village returns, the rhythmic barking of a dog, the distant tolling of the bell, you realize that in the medieval world, the law doesn't want to know the truth. It just wants to know if you can play your part in the theatre of the court. The air in the parish mortuary is a heavy, frozen stillness that feels as though time itself has been packed in ice. The temperature is a profound, windowless chill, the kind of cold that doesn't just rest on your skin but seems to wait for your heartbeat to slow so it can settle into your lungs. You're standing in a small stone chamber lit only by the guttering, oily flame of a single tallow lamp. The texture of the floor beneath your feet is a mixture of damp grit and the smooth, greasy cold of ancient flagstones. You take a slow, rhythmic breath, and the air tastes of old earth, dried lavender, and the faint, sweet, sickly rot of the world that has already passed on. Your breath is a shaky white plume in the gloom, a tiny, frantic signal of life in a room dedicated to the silence of the dead. The sound of the chamber is a rhythmic, oppressive dripping. You hear the slow, deliberate thip of condensation falling from the vaulted ceiling onto a wooden table, and the distant, muffled groan of the church roof as it shifts in the night wind. It's a sound that strips away the noise of the living world, leaving you with nothing but the internal rhythm of your own anxiety. Welcome to cruentation, or the trial of the beer. The elites of the legal world, men who believe that the soul is a physical substance that can linger in the blood, have decided that the best way to catch a murderer is to turn the victim into a witness. The logic is a masterpiece of supernatural absurdity. They believe that the body of a murdered person retains a divine sense of justice, and if the killer touches or even stands near the corpse, the wounds will spontaneously open and bleed afresh. It's a system where the laws of biology are discarded in favour of a biological snitch mechanism. You're currently standing before the bier, a rough-hewn oak platform where a man you barely knew lies in a final cold repose. The texture of the wood is jagged and splintered, the grain stained dark with the shadows of the lamp. You have been accused of his demise because you were seen arguing over the boundary of a wheat field 3 weeks ago. To the magistrate, a man who views your life as a minor footnote in a property dispute, your proximity to the body is the only evidence required. You feel the pressure of the crowd in the doorway, the villagers, their tunics smelling of peat and damp wool, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and boredom. The texture of their presence is a heavy, humid anticipation. The priest, a man who treats miracles like a scheduled delivery, steps forward. The sound of his heavy, embroidered robes brushing against the stone is a dry, sibilant hiss. He doesn't look at the evidence or the timeline, he looks at the holy balance. He commands you to lay your hands upon the chest of the deceased. You reach out. The temperature of the body is a shocking absolute 0. The texture of the cold skin is like damp marble, yielding yet uncomfortably firm. You take a breath, and the air is thick with the scent of the herbs they've used to mask the decay. Sharp rosemary and dusty thyme. Your breath is shallow, synchronized with the rhythmic low-frequency chanting of the priest. Let the blood speak, let the truth flow. The logic of the beer rite is a triumph of bureaucratic laziness. If the body leaks even a single drop of fluid, whether it's blood or just the natural messy processes of a body being a body, the law considers your guilt proven. The elites call this the cry of the innocent blood. You call it a very stressful way to realize that the human body doesn't stop being complicated just because it's stopped breathing. The system has outsourced the jury to a piece of meat on a table. You hold your hand there, feeling the cold seep into your palm. You can hear the rhythmic, high-pitched ringing in your own ears and the dry, papery rustle of the priest's scroll as he waits to record the verdict. Tick, tick, tick. The minutes pass with the weight of centuries. To the magistrate, this is a divine autopsy. To you, it's a moment of pure, unadulterated nonsense. The lamp flickers, casting long, dancing shadows of the serpents carved into the pillars. The body remains silent. No blood flows, no wounds open. The air in the chamber seems to lighten as the miracle fails to happen. The priest sighs, a long, weary sound that suggests he's disappointed he won't be presiding over an execution tomorrow morning. He nods. Because the corpse didn't bleed on you, the law considers your legal argument validated. You are innocent, not because of an alibi, but because a dead man didn't feel like bleeding today. The elites call this the integrity of the flesh. You call it a very eerie way to spend a Friday night. As you pull your hand away, and the sound of the village returns, the rhythmic barking of a dog, the distant clatter of a cart, you realize that in the medieval world, the law doesn't care about your side of the story. It just wants to see if the world of the spirits will do the paperwork for them. The morning light is a pale, sickly yellow, cutting through the high windows of the chancel like a dull blade. The temperature is a dry, stagnant warmth, the kind of heat that doesn't comfort but instead makes your skin feel tight and dusty. You're sitting on a heavy oak bench, the texture of which is rough and splintered, worn smooth only in the spots where generations of the accused have shifted in their anxiety. You take a slow, rhythmic breath, and the air tastes of old stone, dry grain, and the faint, bitter scent of the soot from the church's votive lamps. Your breath is a steady, quiet pulse in the heavy atmosphere, a small sound that feels far too loud in the expectant silence of the village courtroom. Welcome to the ordeal of the morsel, also known as the korsned, the elites of the legal world, men who believe that the throat is a spiritual gateway rather than a biological tube, have decided that the ultimate test of your honesty is your ability to swallow a piece of bread. The logic is a masterpiece of digestive theology. They believe that if you are guilty, God will physically tighten your throat, causing you to choke on the blessed morsel. It is a system where your innocence depends entirely on the lubrication of your esophagus and the size of the baker's ambition. You are currently staring at a small, hard cube of barley bread sitting on a silver paten. The texture of the bread is aggressively dry, the crust looking like a fragment of sun-baked clay. To the magistrate, a man who views your life as a minor interruption to his morning nap, this isn't a piece of food, it's a divine polygraph. He doesn't care that you have a naturally dry throat or that you haven't had a drop of ale since yesterday's sundown. He only cares about the judgment of the swallow. You feel the eyes of the priest on you. The same man who blessed the bread and prayed for the Lord to stop the breath of the liar. The sound of his voice is a rhythmic, low-frequency drone. a monotonous chant that fills the small space with the weight of impending doom. He recites the formula, commanding the bread to become like stone in the mouth of the guilty. The sound of the words echoes off the cold masonry, a rhythmic reminder that in 1324, the law is interested in your salivary glands, not your evidence. The priest hands you the morsel. The texture of the bread in your fingers is cold and unyielding, the edges sharp enough to snag the skin of your palm. You take a breath, and the air is thick with the smell of the priest's robes, a heavy cloying scent of old wool and stale incense. Your breath is shallow, synchronized with the rhythmic clack-clack of the magistrate's rings against the wooden table. The logic of the course net is a triumph of biological superstition. If you manage to swallow the bread without a cough or a sputter, you are innocent. If you gag, you are a criminal who deserves the gallows. The elites call this the testimony of the throat. You call it a very high-risk way to discover that you should have drank more water before coming to court. The system has essentially turned a basic human reflex into a capital offence. You place the bread in your mouth. The texture is a shock of dryness, a desert of flour that instantly claims every drop of moisture in your mouth. You chew, the sound a rhythmic grinding crunch, crunch, crunch in your own ears. You can hear the crowd in the back of the church holding their breath, a collective silence so heavy it seems to press against the walls. To the magistrate, this is divine forensics. To you, it's a struggle against the laws of physics. You swallow. The bread moves slowly, a jagged weight that feels like it's taking its time to decide your fate. Your throat hitches just once, and the sound is a tiny wet gulp that seems to echo like a thunderclap in the still air. The priest narrows his eyes, his quill hovering over his parchment, a sharp rhythmic scritch waiting to be born. The cube finally descends. You remain upright. You do not choke. No blood rushes to your face. The air in the room seems to expand as the judgment concludes. The magistrate sighs, a long weary sound that suggests he's bored by your continued existence. He nods. Because you didn't die of a dry crust, the law considers the accusation of hedge-cutting disproven. You are innocent not because you had a permit, but because your throat didn't betray you today. The elites call this the clarity of the morsel. You call it a very uncomfortable way to justify your morning snack. As you step out of the stifling heat of the chancel and the sound of the village returns, the rhythmic lowing of a cow, the distant shouting of a ploughman, you realise that in the medieval world the law doesn't want to hear your side of the story. It just wants to see if your body will cooperate with its theatre of the absurd. The air in the castle courtyard is a suffocating, churning wall of white steam that smells of ancient iron, wet soot, and a lingering faint hint of yesterday's boiled cabbage. The temperature is a violent transition. One moment you're standing in the biting, slate-grey wind of a January morning, and the next you're leaning over a massive bronze cauldron that is radiating a wet, heavy heat that feels like it's trying to peel the very layers of your skin away. You take a slow, cautious breath, and the air is thick and liquid, coating your lungs with a humid, metallic pressure. Your breath is short and rhythmic, a series of shallow hitches as you stare into the roiling, bubbling heart of the justice system. The texture of the flagstones beneath your feet is slick, covered in a fine sheen of condensation, and the spilled ash from the fire beneath the pot. You are here because the local bailiff, a man whose primary qualification for office seems to be his ability to look, disappointed in everyone simultaneously, has accused you of pasture trespass. In 1324, the elites have decided that the best way to determine if your sheep actually wandered into the Lord's clover is to see how your skin reacts to a cauldron of screaming water. Welcome to the trial by hot water. The logic of the legal world, crafted by men who consider a warm bath a rare and dangerous indulgence, is that God will physically intervene to shield the flesh of the innocent from the laws of thermodynamics. It is a system where the burden of proof is carried entirely by your nervous system. The rule is deceptively simple. You must reach into the boiling water, grab a small stone or a ring from the very bottom, and bring it to the surface without screaming for your mother. The priest, standing a safe 3 feet away from the steam, begins to recite the blessing of the cauldron. The sound of his voice is a rhythmic, monotonous drone, a hypnotic chant that treats your impending third-degree burns as a necessary liturgical ornament. He asks for the water to be truth-telling, and for the liar to be scalded into confession. You can hear the rhythmic crackle hiss of the logs beneath the cauldron, and the deep, hollow glug 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 of the water as it reaches a rolling boil. The texture of the stone at the bottom of the pot looks blurred, shifting through the turbulent water like a dark, uncooperative ghost. You reach in. The temperature shift is an absolute searing shock. It isn't just hot. It feels like the water is physically trying to squeeze your hand into a different shape. Your breath is a sharp, jagged gasp that you manage to swallow just before it escapes. You find the stone. Its texture is unnervingly smooth, a piece of river flint that has no business being part of a court of law. The logic of the ordeal doesn't end with the grabbing. Once you retrieve the stone, they don't look for evidence of pain. Instead, they follow the protocol of the linen. The priest takes your hand. His fingers are soft and dry, the texture of someone who has never touched a tool, and wraps it in a piece of clean white cloth. He ties it with a cord of rough hemp, and the texture of the fabric against your throbbing skin is a rhythmic sandpaper-like irritation. You're told to return in 3 days for the unveiling. The system is a masterpiece of delayed accountability. In 3 days they will unwrap the cloth. If your hand is healing well, a term the magistrate defines with the same vagueness he uses for tax codes, you are innocent. If there are blisters or foulness, you're guilty. They have essentially turned the human inflammatory response into a witness for the prosecution. If you have a high pain tolerance and a clean bandage, you're a law-abiding subject. If you have a natural human reaction to boiling water, you're a criminal. The sound of the crowd as you're dismissed is a low, shuffling mumble, a rhythmic sound of people moving on to see if the baker is selling any hot pies. You walk away, your hand held stiffly against your chest, the rhythmic throb of the burn keeping time with your footsteps. The elites call this the ordeal of the truth. You call it a very elaborate way to find out that water is in fact hot. As you head back toward the shadows of the village, you realize that in the medieval legal world, the truth isn't something you find. It's something you survive, one bubbling cauldron at a time. The air at the edge of the great royal forest is a clinging emerald dampness, a heavy humidity that feels as though the trees are exhaling a thick green fog. The temperature is a deceptive, cooling shade that never quite reaches a comfortable chill. Instead, it lingers like a wet cloth against your neck. You're sitting on a fallen log, the texture of which is a rough, peeling map of damp lichen, and the soft, yielding rot of timber that has been reclaimed by the earth. You take a slow, deep breath, and the air tastes of crushed pine needles, ancient mulch, and the sharp, metallic scent of the rain that has been trapped beneath the dense canopy for a week. Your breath is steady and rhythmic, a quiet sound in the vast, brooding silence of the woods, where the only other noise is the occasional rhythmic plip of water falling from an oak leaf onto your wool hood. Welcome to the Forest Court, also known as the Wood Moat. The elites of the kingdom, men who believe that every blade of grass between here and the horizon is a personal gift from God to the king, have decided that the very concept of nature is a state secret. In 1324, the forest law is a parallel universe of justice that operates outside the common law. The rules are designed to protect the vert and the venison, which is a fancy way of saying the king owns the trees and the deer, and your continued survival depends on not looking at a stag with too much enthusiasm. You're here because of the rule of expeditation. The king's forester, a man who wears a green tunic and an expression of permanent professional suspicion, is currently examining your dog. To the elites, your loyal hound isn't a pet or a farmhand. It's a potential assassin of the royal venison. According to the high-minded legislation of the age, any dog living near the forest must be lawed to ensure it cannot chase a deer. The forester reaches for his tool, a heavy iron chisel. The sound is a rhythmic metallic tink. Tink. Tink, as he taps it against a stone to check its edge. You can smell the sharp, acidic scent of the forester's leather gear and the earthy musk of the mud on his boots. You take a breath, and the air is thick with the smell of the damp earth stirred up by the forester's movements. Your breath is shallow, synchronized with the rhythmic panting of your dog. The logic of lawing is a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. The forester places your dog's paw upon a wooden block. The rule states that 3 claws must be removed from the front foot, or the ball of the foot must be sliced, so that the animal can still walk but can never run fast enough to bother a king's buck. It is a justice system that requires a veterinarian and an executioner to agree on the safety of the forest. The mallet strikes the chisel. The sound is a sharp, percussive thwack that echoes through the trees, followed by a rhythmic, hollow silence as the birds stop singing. The texture of the blood on the wooden block is hot and bright, a stark contrast to the grey, damp shadows of the forest floor. You do not speak. To protest is to disturb the king's peace, an offence that carries a fine of 10 shillings, or the equivalent of your next 3 months of work. The logic of the forest court is a triumph of property over humanity. If you are found with a bow and arrow in the woods, you are a poacher. If you are found with a piece of fallen timber, you are a thief of vert. Even if you're simply walking through the trees after sundown, the law assumes you're plotting against a squirrel. The system has turned the landscape itself into a giant leafy trap. You feel the texture of the air change as the forester finishes his work, the dampness becoming a cold, biting wind that whistles through the branches. The sound of the forest returns, the rhythmic rustling of the leaves, the distant tap of a woodpecker. The elites call this the preservation of the royal hunt. You call it a very brutal way to be told that even the shade of the trees is a taxable commodity. As the forester wipes his blade and moves on to the next village, you realise that in the medieval world the law doesn't stop at the village gate. It follows you into the wild, making sure that even the animals you love are mutilated in the name of a king who will never even know your name. The air in the small side chapel is a heavy frozen silence, stagnant chill that feels as though the very breath of the room has been held since the last confession. The temperature is a biting, motionless cold, the kind that doesn't just touch your skin but sinks through your layers of wool and linen, seeking out the warmth of your heartbeat and replacing it with the slow, dull ache of the masonry. You are standing perfectly still before a stone crucifix, your arms outstretched to your sides, mirroring the figure on the wall. The texture of the floor beneath your bare knees is a series of cold, unyielding ridges and the damp grit of ancient mortar. You take a slow, rhythmic breath, and the air tastes of burnt wick, old candle fat, and the dry, ashy scent of the stone dust. Your breath is a series of shallow, rhythmic hitches, a quiet struggle against the gravity that is currently trying to drag your soul toward the floor. Welcome to the ordeal of the cross, or judicium crucis. The elites of the church, men who believe that the truth is a physical endurance test, have decided that the best way to resolve your dispute over a boundary fence is to turn you into a human statue. The logic is a masterpiece of vertical theology. You and your accuser are placed side by side, arms raised, while a priest recites a series of lengthy psalms. According to this high-level judicial framework, God, who's apparently very interested in your deltoid endurance, will grant strength to the arms of the truthful man, while the liar's limbs will grow heavy with the weight of his sins. You can hear the rhythmic, monotonous chanting of the priest behind you. The sound is a low-frequency drone that vibrates against the back of your skull, treating your mounting physical agony as a minor liturgical detail. To the priest, this isn't a legal proceeding, it's a spiritual workout. He doesn't care that your shoulders feel as though they are being pierced by 1,000 white-hot needles, or that your fingers have gone numb in the damp chapel air. He only cares that he doesn't stumble over the Latin. The texture of the air around your outstretched hands is thin and sharp. You can feel the rhythmic pulse of the blood in your fingertips, a frantic, thrumming beat that seems to mock the stillness of the room. Your accuser, a man who smells of wet leather and sour milk, is standing 3 feet away. You watch him out of the corner of your eye. His breath is coming in ragged, rhythmic puffs, and you see the slight telltale tremor in his left hand. The judgment has reached the point where the law is no longer about fences or land. It is about who can ignore the laws of physics the longest. The logic of the cross ordeal is a triumph of bureaucratic minimalism. There are no witnesses to cross-examine, no scrolls to read, and no evidence to weigh. There is only the clock of the human body. The first person to drop their arms is the loser. The elites call this the victory of the righteous spirit over the frail flesh. You call it a very exhausting way to discover that your neighbour has a higher tolerance for shoulder cramps than you do. The system has essentially turned the local courtroom into a competitive standing match. You feel the texture of the sweat beginning to crawl down your spine, a cold, rhythmic tickle that makes you want to flinch, but you remain frozen. You can hear the muffled, hollow thud of a closing book and the rhythmic clack-clack of the priest's beads as he moves on to the next set of prayers. The minutes stretch into an eternity of silence and shadow. To the magistrate sitting comfortably on a padded stool in the corner, This is a divine demonstration. To you, it's a moment where your entire future depends on your ability to pretend your arms aren't currently on fire. The lamp flickers, and for a moment the shadows of your outstretched arms look like giant dark wings against the weeping stone walls. Suddenly a sound shatters the stillness, a heavy wet slap as your accuser's arms hit his sides. He collapses into a heap of exhausted wool and shame. The air in the chapel seems to expand with a collective rhythmic exhale. The priest stops chanting and makes a mark on his scroll. Because you stood still longer, the law considers your fence line divinely sanctioned. You're innocent, not because you had a map, but because you outweighted a man's muscles. The elites call this the persistence of the truth. You call it a very painful way to keep your property. As you finally lower your arms, the sound of your joints popping like dry twigs in the quiet, you realise that in the medieval world, the law doesn't want to see your documents. It just wants to see if you can hold your breath and your posture until the bureaucracy is satisfied. The air in the town marketplace is a biting slate-grey frost, a sharp wind that whistles through the timber frames of the market stalls and settles in the hollow of your throat. The temperature is a cruel, unmoving chill, the kind of cold that turns the dampness of your breath into a fine layer of rime on your wool collar. You're kneeling in the mud, your neck and wrists trapped between two heavy beams of seasoned oak. The texture of the wood is rough and splintered, the grain weathered into jagged ridges that bite into your skin with a dry, abrasive heat. You take a slow, cautious breath, and the air tastes of wet soot, rotting cabbage, and the metallic, sharp tang of the freezing iron chain that tethers the structure to the ground. Your breath is a rhythmic white plume in the morning air, a tiny signal of distress in a square that is currently filling with the sound of collective mockery. Welcome to the pillory, the justice system's favourite way of outsourcing your punishment to the local mob. The elites of the town, men who watch the world from behind leaded glass windows while sipping warmed cider, have decided that the best way to correct your unseemly speech is to turn your face into a public target. In 1324, shame is not just a feeling. It is a legal category, a municipal tool used to enforce the social order. You are here because you dared to suggest that the mayor's recent tax on well water was perhaps a bit ambitious. According to the high-level legal thinkers of the Guildhall, your honesty is a nuisance to the common peace, and the remedy is a day of horizontal humiliation. The sound of the marketplace is a percussive, rhythmic chaos. You hear the sharp, dry clack-clack of the baker's carts, the rhythmic lowing of a calf being led to the shambles, and the low-frequency mumble of the crowd as they begin to gather. To the magistrate, this isn't a cruelty. It's a civic lesson. He believes that by exposing your frail character to the community, he's strengthening the moral fabric of the parish. He doesn't care that your neck feels as though it is being crushed by a millstone, or that your knees are sinking into a slurry of freezing mud and horse dung. He only cares that the sentence is properly witnessed. The texture of the mud beneath you is a cold, yielding slime, a mixture of earth and the discarded waste of 1,000 market days. You can hear the rhythmic wet thwack of a rotten turnip hitting the wood just inches from your ear, followed by a chorus of mocking laughter. The sound echoes in the small of your back, a rhythmic reminder that in the medieval world, justice is a spectator sport. You take a breath, and the air is thick with the scent of the crowd, a heavy, cloying musk of unwashed wool, stale ale, and the sharp, acidic smell of old sweat. The logic of the pillory is a masterpiece of bureaucratic distancing. The law provides the wood and the iron, but the neighbours provide the violence. If you are liked, you might spend the day dodging nothing but insults. If you are disliked, the justice involves stones, filth, and the high probability of losing an ear to a well-aimed piece of flint. The elites call this the correction of the public eye. You call it a very efficient way to discover exactly who in your village has a grudge and a good throwing arm. The system has essentially turned the local square into a mandatory theatre of the absurd. You feel the texture of the cold wind against your exposed face, a sharp stinging pressure that makes your skin feel like parchment. You can hear the rhythmic hollow dong-dong-dong of the town clock, marking the hours of your reformation. To the magistrate sitting in his heated office, this is a symbolic purgation. To you, it's a struggle against the laws of gravity and the cruelty of your fellow man. The shadows of the gallows in the distance grow longer as the sun makes its indifferent. journey across the sky. For a moment, the rhythmic sound of the market dies down, leaving you with nothing but the sound of your own heartbeat thrumming in your neck. You realise that in the medieval legal world, the law doesn't just want your money or your labour. It wants your dignity, offered up as a sacrifice to a system that prefers order to logic. As the sun begins to dip and the crowd disperses to the taverns, you realise that the wood doesn't care if you were right. It only knows how to hold you still while the world throws its worst at you. The air inside the temporary court tent is a swirling, chaotic mix of freezing drafts from the mud outside and the cloying, dusty heat of 1,000 bodies moving through the fairgrounds. The temperature is an unstable, vibrating warmth, the kind of heat that feels temporary and thin, as if the canvas walls could collapse at any moment and let the biting wind of the valley reclaim the space. You're standing before a rough table made of 2 planks laid across cider barrels. The texture of the wood is raw, sappy, and covered in a fine layer of sawdust that sticks to your damp palms. You take a slow, rhythmic breath, and the air tastes of exotic cloves, trodden beer, and the sharp, gamey aroma of the livestock pens just 20 yards away. Your breath is a series of short, panicked puffs, white against the dark canvas, a frantic signal that you are currently caught in the fastest gear of the medieval legal machine. Welcome to the Court of Pie Powders. The elites, men who believe that justice should be as slow and dignified as a cathedral's growth, have made a special exception for the marketplace. The name comes from the French pieds poudrés, meaning dusty feet. It is a justice system for the traveller, the merchant, and the person who just got swindled out of 3 pence by a man selling miraculous sheep liniment. The rule is deceptively simple. Justice must be done before the dust can settle on your boots, or before the tide of the fair goes out. In this system, due process has been replaced by a stopwatch made of greed. You are here because you accused a merchant of selling you a sack of grain that was 50% sawdust and 50% optimism. To the steward of the fair, a man who treats the law like a high-speed ledger, and whose primary goal is to reach the tavern by sunset, your dispute is an annoying interruption to his collection of stall taxes. He doesn't care about your hunger or the textures of the evidence, he only cares about the rhythm of the trade. He wants a verdict before the next drumbeat from the town crier. You feel the pressure of the crowd pressing against the back of the tent, the other traders, their tunics smelling of wood smoke and leather, their eyes darting toward the exits as they calculate their own profits. The texture of their presence is a heavy, humid impatience. The steward reaches for a small iron bell on the table. The sound, a sharp, percussive tinkle-clink, shatters the low-frequency mumble of the court, a rhythmic signal that your time is running out. He doesn't ask for a jury of your peers, he asks for the custom of the fair. The logic of the pie powder court is a masterpiece of bureaucratic efficiency. Witnesses are whatever strangers happen to be standing near the stall at noon. Evidence is whatever hasn't been eaten or hidden yet. If you can't prove your claim in the time it takes for the steward to finish his cup of watered wine, the law assumes the merchant is a saint and you are a nuisance. The elites call this the grease that keeps the wheels of commerce turning. You call it a very fast way to be told that you're now 3 pence poorer and legally prohibited from complaining about it. You touch the sack of grain. The texture is gritty and light, the dry smell of the pine shavings rising up to mock your nose. You can hear the rhythmic, high-pitched laughter of the merchant behind you, and the steady thump, thump, thump of a nearby weaver's loom. The minutes are measured by the shifting shadows on the tent floor. To the steward, this is summary justice. To you, it's a moment of pure, accelerated frustration. The steward makes a mark on a scrap of parchment, a sharp, rhythmic scritch-scritch that sounds like a mouse in a bread box. He nods. Because the merchant has a charter of protection from the local lord, and your dusty feet suggest you'll be in the next county by morning, the court finds in favour of the status quo. You are compensated with a shrug, and a reminder that the fair is no place for the soft-hearted. The air in the tent seems to grow even thinner as the next case is called, a dispute over a blind mule. You walk out into the cooling afternoon air, your boots hitting the slurry of the fairground with a rhythmic splat squish. The elites call this the swift hand of the law. You call it a very efficient way to ensure the rich get richer, while the rest of the world keeps walking. As you disappear into the crowd and the sound of the fair returns, the rhythmic clanging of bells, the distant shouting of a juggler, you realise that in the medieval world, the law doesn't always want to be right. Sometimes, it just wants to be finished. The temperature in the small, windowless stone chamber at the back of the sheriff's hall is a low, persistent humidity. The kind of dampness that feels like a physical weight pressing against your shoulders. It's a room where the air has gone to sleep, undisturbed by drafts or sunlight. You're sitting on a low wooden bench, the texture of which is a series of deep, rhythmic grooves carved by centuries of waiting. You take a slow, deep breath, and the air tastes of dried wormwood, stale lavender, and the sharp, metallic tang of the iron door latch. Your breath is a quiet, rhythmic pulse in the heavy stillness, a soft sound that seems to echo against the weeping masonry of the walls. Welcome to the jury of matrons, the elites of the legal world, men who wear heavy silk robes and discuss the laws of nature while sitting in comfortable chairs, have decided that there are some parts of the human experience that are too messy for their high-minded ledgers. In 1324, if a woman is sentenced to death but claims she's carrying a child, a process known as pleading her belly, the judge doesn't consult a physician. Instead, he summons 12 discreet and lawful matrons from the village to perform a biological audit. It is a justice system where the ultimate verdict on a human life is delivered by 12 grandmothers in a room that smells of peppermint and unwashed wool. You are witnessing the arrival of the jury. They are a collection of local women whose hands are stained with the juice of late summer berries and whose aprons carry the texture of 1,000 days of hard labour. They move with a rhythmic, heavy grace, their wooden patterns clacking against the stone floor with a steady percussive thump-clack. To the judge, who is currently waiting in the courtyard and looking repeatedly at his sundial, these women are a necessary clerical inconvenience. He doesn't care about the textures of life. He only cares if the evidence is tangible enough to postpone an execution. The matrons form a circle around the accused. The sound of the room is a low-frequency mumble, the rhythmic, sibilant whispering of the women as they consult their shared memory of motherhood. They don't use scrolls or quills, they use their hands. The texture of their touch is cold and calloused, yet surprisingly gentle. According to the high-level judicial theory of the age, God has granted women a secret, instinctive knowledge of the quickening the moment the soul enters the body. In this system, the rule of law is replaced by the rule of intuition. The logic of the jury of matrons is a masterpiece of bureaucratic outsourcing. If the women declare the prisoner is quick with child, the gallows are denied their prize for now. The law provides the sentence, but the village women provide the reprieve. The elites call this the mercy of the quickening. You call it a very strange way for the Crown to admit it doesn't understand how bodies work. The system has essentially turned the local tavern keepers and weavers into a mobile forensics unit. You feel the pressure of the air in the room, which has become heavy with the scent of a tallow candle burning in the corner, a greasy, thick smoke that tickles your throat. You can hear the rhythmic, distant caw-caw of a crow on the roof and the muffled thud-thud-thud of a horse's tail swatting flies in the yard. The minutes pass with a slow, deliberate wait. To the magistrate, this is a biological recess. To you, it's a moment where a woman's life depends on whether 12 neighbours agree on a heartbeat. The head matron, a woman with a face as lined as an old map, steps toward the door. The sound of the iron bolt sliding back is a sharp, rhythmic clack-shree. She speaks to the clerk outside. Because the jury has found signs of the life, the legal machine grinds to a temporary halt. The elites call this the preservation of the innocent soul. You call it a very fortunate moment of village solidarity in a world that usually prefers a clean execution to a complicated birth. As the matrons file out and the sound of the square returns, the rhythmic clanging of the church bell, the distant shouting of a fishmonger, you realise that in the medieval world the law doesn't always have the final word. Sometimes the secrets of the village are the only thing standing between a neighbour and the rope. You take a breath, feeling the cool, green air of the hallway replace the stagnant scent of the room, and you realise that even in a system that makes no sense, there are small, rhythmic pockets of humanity hidden in the shadows of the law. The air at the edge of the dark, tangled heath is a sharp, unyielding frost, a cold that doesn't just bite your skin but seems to actively hunt for the gaps in your wool cloak. The temperature is a profound, hollow stillness, the kind of freeze that turns the moisture in the soil into jagged needles of ice that crunch beneath your feet with a rhythmic, brittle protest. You are crouching in the shadows of a gnarled hawthorn tree, the texture of the bark a chaotic map of deep ridges and sharp, frozen thorns that snag against your sleeves. You take a slow, cautious breath, and the air tastes of iron, dead bracken, and the faint, bitter scent of the distant charcoal burners' pits. Your breath is a short, rhythmic flutter of white vapour, a tiny, translucent signal of your existence in a world that has legally decided you no longer have one. Welcome to the law of outlawry, also known as the caput lupinum, the wolf's head. The elites of the kingdom, men who sleep in beds draped in silk and who view the law as a grand intellectual game of chess, have decided that the ultimate punishment for missing your court date is to erase your humanity. In 1324, if you are accused of a crime and fail to appear after being exacted at 4 consecutive county courts, the magistrate doesn't just issue a warrant. He declares you an outlaw. He strips away your name, your rights, and your protection. In the eyes of the bureaucracy, you are no longer a man. You are a wild animal, a wolf that anyone is permitted, and in some cases encouraged, to kill on sight for a reward. You feel the texture of the cold dirt beneath your fingernails as you press your hand against the earth. It is a gritty, frozen resistance, the feeling of a world that has officially closed its doors to you. You are here because you were accused of breaking the Lord's park to fetch a fallen branch for your fire, and the summons was delivered to a house you had already fled. To the judge, a man who considers a warm hearth a basic right of his station, your absence is a contumacious rebellion. He signed your decree with a flourish of his quill, a sharp rhythmic scritch, and went back to his dinner of roasted peacock, never once wondering where a man with a wolf's head might sleep on a night this cold. The sound of the heath is a rhythmic predatory silence. You hear the slow, deliberate snap of a dry twig somewhere to your left, followed by the sibilant hiss of the wind through the dead grass. Every noise is a threat, every shadow a potential bounty hunter. In this system, justice is a bounty placed on your literal head. The rule is deceptively simple. Because you broke the social contract by not showing up to the village hall, the contract no longer protects your neck. The elites call this the expulsion from the king's peace. You call it a very lonely way to discover that you're now worth 5 shillings to anyone with a sharp knife and no conscience. The logic of outlawry is a masterpiece of legal laziness. If the state can't catch you, they simply make it everyone's job to destroy you. You are outside the law, which means you cannot own property, you cannot marry, and you cannot even buy a piece of bread without committing another crime. The texture of the air around you feels thin and hostile, as if even the atmosphere is trying to reject a man with no legal standing. You breathe in, and the air tastes of cold ash, and the metallic tang of the rusted dagger at your belt, the only legal counsel you have left. You can hear the rhythmic, distant barking of a village dog, and the muffled thump, thump, thump of a horse's hooves on the road half a mile away. The minutes are measured by the slow, rhythmic pulsing of the blood in your ears, and the steady, cold dripping of the frost melting off the hawthorn berries. To the magistrate sitting in his stone manor, you are a legal fiction, a name to be crossed off a list. To you, it's a struggle for every cubic inch of oxygen in a realm that has declared your breath a trespass. The moon rises, casting a long skeletal shadow of the tree across the frozen mud. For a moment, the rhythmic sound of the wind dies down, leaving you with nothing but the sound of your own heartbeat thrumming in your chest, the beat of a man who is legally a ghost. You realize that in the medieval legal world, the law doesn't just want to punish your body, it wants to delete your existence, leaving you to wander the margins of the world like a shadow with a price tag. As you shift your weight and the ice crunches beneath you, you realize that the earth doesn't care about the king's decree. It only knows the rhythm of the survivor, even when the rest of the world is calling for your head. The air in the shallow, mud-choked ditch at the edge of the parish is a raw, stinging dampness, a heavy, low-lying mist that seems to have absorbed the very essence of the stagnant water and the rotting leaves. The temperature is a hollow grey freeze, the kind of cold that doesn't just numb your skin but seems to settle in your joints like a physical weight, making every movement feel as slow and deliberate as the turning of a water wheel. You're standing ankle-deep in the slurry, your fingers absent-mindedly tracing the texture of your rough wool cloak. The fibres are sodden and heavy, feeling like a layer of cold, wet lead against your shoulders. You take a slow, rhythmic breath, and the air tastes of iron, wet sedge and the metallic, biting scent of the coroner's iron-bound chest. Your breath is a slow, rhythmic plume of white vapour, a quiet, repetitive signal of life in a landscape that is currently being audited for its mortality. Welcome to the coroner's inquest and the law of murderum. The elites of the kingdom, men who spend their mornings counting gold in well-heated counting houses, have decided that death is not just a tragedy but a significant revenue opportunity. In 1324, if a body is found in the open, the local coroner doesn't just look for a killer, he looks for a profit. The logic is a masterpiece of post-conquest paranoia. Because the Norman rulers are still a little nervous about the locals, they created a rule stating that if any man is found dead, and the village cannot prove he was English, a process known as the presentment of Englishry, the law assumes he was a Norman, and the entire community must pay a massive murderum fine to the king. It is a justice system where your innocence depends on your ability to prove the genealogy of a corpse in a ditch. You are currently witnessing the presentment. A group of village elders, their tunics smelling of wood smoke and old ale, are standing in a rhythmic, sombre line. The texture of the ground beneath them is a clinging, heavy clay that seems to want to swallow their boots whole. To the coroner, a man whose face is as sharp and cold as a winter flint, this isn't a moment of grief. It's a high-stakes appraisal. He doesn't care about the man's name or how he ended up in the sedge. He only cares about the rhythm of the fine. He wants a verdict that maximizes the crown's treasury. The sound of the ditch is a rhythmic, bureaucratic drone. You hear the sharp, dry scritch-scratch of the coroner's quill against a roll of calfskin, and the distant, sibilant hiss of the wind through the bulrushes. Every sound is a measurement, every silence a potential fee. In this system, the village is legally guilty until they can find enough witnesses to swear to the deceased's English blood. The rule is deceptively simple. If you can't find a grandmother who remembers the man's Saxon roots, the village owes the king 40 marks, or the equivalent of every sheep in the parish. The coroner moves his hand over his ledger. The texture of the paper is oily and stiff, the ink a dark, brittle crust. He mutters about the lack of credible testimony. According to the high-level judicial theory of the day, the king's peace is a commodity that must be paid for, especially when it's been broken by a dead man. It is a justice system that requires a genealogist and a tax collector to agree on the ethnicity of the tragedy. You feel the texture of the air change, becoming a sharp, biting wind that rattles the dry reeds. The sound of the inquest begins to fade as the elders fail to produce a convincing witness. The coroner makes a final mark on his scroll, a sharp rhythmic thud of his seal against the wax. Because the Englishry was not proven, the village is now officially in debt to the throne. The elites call this the enforcement of the king's protection. You call it a very efficient way for the crown to get paid for a crime they haven't even solved yet. The shadows of the trees grow longer as the coroner's party prepares to leave, the rhythmic clink 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 of their harness bells sounding like a mocking laugh in the cold air. For a moment the ditch returns to its silence, leaving you with nothing but the sound of your own heartbeat thrumming in your ears. You realise that in the medieval legal world, the law doesn't just want to find a murderer, it wants to make sure that even in death the common people are providing a return on investment for the king. As the sun dips and the village prepares to count its losses, you realise that the mud doesn't care who ruled the land. It only knows the weight of the bodies and the cold rhythmic flow of the water in the ditch. The night has finally reached its most hollow, silent hour, the moment when the temperature in your small cottage is indistinguishable from the freezing earth beneath the floorboards. This is the hour of the king's curfew. In 1324, the rules of the kingdom have gone quiet, but their shadow remains, long and heavy across your soul. You are lying in the dark, your fingers absent-mindedly tracing the texture of the rough wool blanket. The fibres are dry and scratchy, a familiar abrasive comfort. You take a slow rhythmic breath, and the air tastes of cooling ash, old timber, and the faint, sweet, sickly scent of the dying tallow candle. Your breath is a steady white vapour in the gloom, a quiet, repetitive signal that you have survived another day in a world that seems to treat your life as a series of bureaucratic accidents. Welcome to the law of the year and a day. The elites of the kingdom, men who spend their lives inside stone fortresses and who view the common people as part of the landscape, have created a rule that says if a person can hide within the walls of a chartered town for exactly a year and a day without being caught by their lord, they become legally free. It is a justice system built on the premise that freedom is not a right, but a very long game of hide and seek. You are currently finishing your final night of that year. You have lived in the shadows, worked for pennies in the tanneries, and dodged every official with a badge. To the magistrate, you are a fugitive asset. To yourself, you are a heartbeat away from being a different species of human. The sound of the night is a rhythmic, oppressive stillness. You hear the slow, deliberate creak groan of the house settling into the mud and the distant, muffled barking of a guard dog at the city gate. It is a sound that measures the distance between your old life and your new one. You breathe in, and the air is thick with the scent of the city's night soul, a heavy, humid musk of unwashed bodies, stagnant gutters, and the metallic tang of the harbour. Your breath is slow, synchronised with the rhythmic, hollow clack-clack of the night watchman's staff against the cobblestones 2 streets away. The logic of the medieval justice system is a masterpiece of contradictions. It has tried to drown you in holy ponds, burn you with glowing iron, choke you with dry bread, and mutilate your dog, in the name of a forest. It has treated your cart like a criminal, and your neighbour's womb like a ledger. But because you have outweighted the clock and outrun the bailiff, the law is about to perform its final, most nonsensical trick. At sunrise, the very same system that called you a thief will call you a free citizen. The elites call this the transformative power of the urban air. You call it a very exhausting way to prove that time can heal a legal record. You feel the texture of the air change, becoming a sharp pre-dawn frost that whistles through the gaps in the thatch. The sound of the first church bell, clanging, rhythmic and solemn, marks the end of your year. You realise that in the medieval world, the law doesn't want to find the truth or deliver fairness. It just wants to follow its own tangled, absurd rhythm until the paperwork is finished. You have played the part, you have survived the theatre, and now the curtain is finally falling on your legal ordeal. You have survived the trial of the water and the heat of the iron. You have navigated the maze of oaths, the fury of the combat ring, and the cold logic of the coroner's ditch. Now you get to rest. Let the darkness wrap around you, not as a threat, but as a blanket. Let the quiet fill your mind. The story's over, the work is done. Sleep well. The past isn't going anywhere. It will be there if you ever want to visit again. But for now, just drift. Good night.